It was October 1986, a crisp Virginia night. The moon spilled a thin silver glow over Chesapeake Ridge Road, a quiet, scenic stretch of road known more for lovers' drives and weekend picnics than for anything sinister. But in the stillness, a car sat abandoned, its doors unlocked, its windows rolled down. Inside, two young people, a man and a woman, both brutally murdered. The crime scene was silent, almost staged. There were no signs of robbery, no struggle that made sense, just two lives, extinguished in the kind of place where people usually came to fall in love. And as investigators would soon discover, this wasn't a random tragedy. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would stalk Virginia's lovers' lanes for years. What happened along Chesapeake Ridge Road? Who killed them? And why did it keep happening again and again? To understand the terror that gripped the region, we need to rewind the clock. The first known victims were Michael Davis and Laura Pierce. Michael was 27, a former Navy man, lean and confident, with the kind of quiet charisma that made people naturally trust him. He worked in security now, the kind of job that demanded precision. Friends described him as steady, the guy you'd call if your car broke down at 2 a.m. Laura was different. She had this fierce independence that set her apart from most women her age. She was ambitious, intelligent, and fiercely protective of the people she cared about. Her laugh, people always remembered her laugh. She'd been studying, planning, dreaming of a future far brighter than most could imagine. But what began as an evening of quiet connection would end as a haunting crime scene that baffled investigators for decades. October 12, 1986. The air smelt of pine and salt water from the nearby James River. Chesapeake Ridge Road cut through stretches of forest and coastline, a two-lane ribbon of road that seemed to belong more to history than to modern life. Michael and Laura's car was found near one of the scenic overlooks, a spot where couples often pulled over to watch the tide shift and the stars bleed into the sky. When a passing driver noticed the car, it looked oddly still. No movement, no signs of life, just an Oldsmobile parked awkwardly close to the edge. The driver slowed, frowned, but didn't stop. Something about the scene felt wrong, though. Hours later, another motorist made the same observation. This time, police were called. What they found inside was chilling. Laura was slumped in the passenger seat. Michael was nearby. Both had been strangled, their throats cut. Yet the car didn't look like a scene of frenzy. It looked neat, almost surgical. Their wallets and belongings were left behind. Nothing was stolen. Nothing vandalized. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't random violence. It was something else. The killer had taken his time. Investigators also noted something disturbing. The bodies showed no signs of sexual assault, which made the motive even more confusing. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about lust. It was personal. Or worse, predatory in a way that made no sense. One more detail chilled detectives. It appeared that gasoline had been poured inside the car, as if the killer intended to set it ablaze, but for some reason never did. Why? Was he interrupted? Or did he want the crime to be discovered? Imagine the silence of that scene, the smell of fuel lingering in the air, the stillness of two lives cut short, flashing police lights bouncing off the dark waters nearby. Officers whispered among themselves, trying to piece it together. Some swore it felt less like a random murder and more like an execution. And in the quiet, another question lingered. If someone had the nerve to commit such a brutal act here, in a public spot, along a road frequently patrolled, What did that say about him? He was confident. He was organized. And he wasn't done. In the hours before their deaths, Michael might have been talking about the Navy, how he missed the sea, but not the routine. Laura might have been laughing, recounting some small detail from her week, brushing back her hair as the cool October wind pushed through the open window. Perhaps they didn't notice the car pulling up behind them. Perhaps they thought nothing of it. Maybe when the knock came at the driver's side window, Michael rolled it down without hesitation. Maybe he assumed it was a park ranger, asking them to move along. What if the figure standing there flashed something, a badge perhaps, or something that looked official enough to lower their guard? What if that was how the night turned? From the start, police suspected the killer had lured the victims into compliance. There was no sign of forced entry. The doors were unlocked. Their positions in the car suggested they hadn't fought. Some detectives whispered about the possibility of an imposter, a man pretending to be law enforcement, stopping couples along Chesapeake Ridge Road. The detail about gasoline fed another theory. Maybe he wanted the bodies destroyed, the evidence erased, but something spooked him before he lit the match. Still, others believed the crime was personal. Both Michael and Laura were intelligent, well-liked people. Could it have been someone they knew? A jealous ex? A grudge carried from the past? Forensic evidence was thin. Chesapeake Ridge Road wasn't exactly generous with witnesses, just long stretches of road and woods. By the time police canvassed the area, no one could provide useful leads. No screams had been heard. No strange vehicles remembered. Just silence. The case shook the local community. Newspapers ran headlines about the gruesome discovery, but behind the scenes, law enforcement kept details quiet. They didn't want to alarm the public with talk of a potential serial killer. But 2 people were dead, and the way they had died suggested planning, patience, and something darker than a simple crime of passion. What no one realized then, what no one could realize, is that this wasn't an isolated tragedy. Because over the next 3 years, Chesapeake Ridge Road would become the hunting ground for one of the most terrifying and mysterious killers in American history. And Michael and Laura's deaths, they were only the beginning.
Spring, 1987. The air around Chesapeake Bay carried that humid warmth that comes just before summer settles in. The scent of pine and salt lingered through the marshlands. The Chesapeake Ridge Road, winding between Williamsburg and Yorktown, was waking from its winter quiet. But beneath that peaceful surface, something malignant was still there. It had been 6 months since the first double homicide. The official reports on the deaths of Michael Davis and Laura Pierce had gone quiet. The investigation had grown cold, with few leads and no clear suspect. Locals whispered about it still, but life moved on. And that's when it happened again. Ethan Ward and Kelly Hart. Ethan was 20 years old, grounded and responsible beyond his years. He worked with his father in the family's contracting business, fixing roofs, painting houses, saving money for a better future. His younger brother described him as steady, always thinking ahead. He wasn't the kind to take reckless chances. Kelly was just 14, a freshman in high school, bubbly, curious, always chasing new experiences. To her friends, Ethan was that older guy she liked, someone she admired, maybe even had a crush on. Theirs wasn't some dark, forbidden love. It was a bond that hovered somewhere between friendship and fascination, the kind of connection teenagers don't yet know how to define. That September evening, they decided to take a drive. Maybe it was a chance to talk privately, away from watchful eyes. Maybe it was something innocent, a short ride to the water to watch the lights shimmer across the bay. No one could have imagined that it would be their last. September 20, 1987. When dawn broke, a park ranger driving near the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge noticed a dark pickup truck abandoned near the James River Bridge. The driver's door was open. The keys were still in the ignition. Inside, a radio played softly, static humming between channels. A jacket was folded neatly on the passenger seat. To the untrained eye, it could have looked like someone had gone for a walk and forgotten to lock up. But when the ranger checked the nearby shoreline, he saw footprints. 2 sets, leading into the mist. 3 days later, those footprints would lead investigators to horror. Ethan's body was found on the edge of the marsh, lying face down in shallow water. Kelly's was discovered 30 feet away, partially concealed by reeds. Both had been shot in the head. The killer had used a handgun. There were no signs of sexual assault, no clear motive. Their wallets and jewelry were still there. Another double murder. Another couple. Another open space near the Chesapeake Ridge Road. This wasn't coincidence anymore. Imagine the fear rippling through that small community. Teenagers who once drove along the ridge to talk, to kiss, to dream, now avoided it entirely. Parents forbade late-night drives. Couples canceled their weekend plans. At candlelight vigils, people held each other close, whispering prayers. A mother in tears, a brother in disbelief. "I told him not to go out that night," Ethan's mother reportedly said. "He told me it was fine. He said, 'I'll be home soon.' He never came home." Investigators scoured the area, desperate for clues. Tire tracks, shell casings, footprints. But the elements had done their damage. Rain, wind, the rising tide. Most evidence was gone. And one detail kept gnawing at them. The way the truck door had been left open, the keys still in the ignition. It looked like they'd been interrupted, perhaps by someone they trusted. The idea that a serial killer was stalking lovers along Chesapeake Ridge began to take hold within the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. The first victims, Michael and Laura, had been strangled and their throats cut. Ethan and Kelly had been shot. Different methods, but the same pattern. A couple, secluded location near the ridge, no robbery, no sexual motive, both victims left at or near the scene. Could it be the same person evolving? Or 2 killers with eerily similar instincts? FBI profilers leaned toward the first theory. Their early profile suggested a white male, late 20s to 30s, likely someone with law enforcement or military training, comfortable with weapons, confident around authority, someone who could approach victims without raising alarm. And that's when the rumor began to spread, one that would haunt the investigation for years. Multiple witnesses came forward claiming they'd been stopped along the ridge at night by men claiming to be park rangers or police officers. One couple even described being pulled over by an unmarked car flashing a red light. But Chesapeake Ridge didn't have regular traffic stops, and those who patrolled it rarely operated alone. What if the killer had a badge? What if he used authority as his weapon? Imagine it. Flashing lights in your rear-view mirror. You pull over, heart racing, wondering what you did wrong. A man steps out of the shadows, calm and polite. Maybe he asks for your license. Maybe he says, "Step out of the vehicle for a moment." You comply, because why wouldn't you? And then, you never make it home. Ethan might have felt uneasy, the headlights behind him lingering a little too long. Kelly could have laughed nervously, brushing it off. "Maybe it's just a ranger," she might have said. He nodded, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. The man who approached could have seemed official, confident, calm, maybe even friendly. He might have said, "You can't park here after dark. Let's just talk for a minute." They step out of the car. Then a sound cuts through the night. A metallic click. A gun being cocked. Everything changes. By late 1987, local authorities and the FBI were officially collaborating. They reviewed both sets of murders side by side. Similarities leapt off the page. Remote, scenic area near water, no witnesses, personal items left behind, suggestion of a calm approach rather than forced violence. Investigators started to believe the killer might be hunting for couples, an individual who took pleasure not only in the killing, but in the ritual of control, the psychological dominance. But why couples? A profiler suggested it could be about power over intimacy, a resentment towards relationships, perhaps rooted in rejection or betrayal. Someone whose rage simmered beneath a facade of normality. One FBI agent described it bluntly. "This person isn't just killing, he's staging dominance. Each crime scene is quiet, organized, deliberate. It's like he's painting fear."
By now, the Chesapeake Ridge wasn't just a stretch of road. It was a phantom, a name that carried dread. News outlets began linking the murders. Reporters used the term the Chesapeake Ridge Killer. Theories spread faster than facts. Was it a rogue cop? A former ranger? A vengeful ex-lover? And yet, no arrests were made. Even as the FBI issued cautious warnings, they struggled to connect the crimes with hard evidence. No fingerprints, no ballistics match, no eyewitnesses who could place a suspicious figure near the scenes. And that was the cruelest part. Whoever this was, he was invisible. Ethan's father stood by the marsh for hours after his son's body was found. Reporters said he just stared out across the water, not moving, not speaking. Later, he told one officer, "I keep waiting to hear his truck pull into the driveway. I still think I will." Kelly's friends made a small shrine at the edge of her high school campus. Flowers, notes, photos, a candle that someone kept relighting every evening until the wind or rain took it. There's a kind of grief that doesn't fade. It just reshapes itself into silence. That's what the Chesapeake Ridge murders left behind. 2 couples, 4 bodies, 2 different methods, 1 haunting pattern. And while investigators combed through dead ends, the killer was already planning his next move. Somewhere along the dark bends of that road, he was watching, waiting. The Chesapeake Ridge wasn't done claiming lives, because less than a year later, another couple would vanish into the night. And this time, what police found wouldn't just terrify them, it would change how they viewed the entire case. April 9th, 1988, a Friday night, the kind of early spring evening when college campuses start to hum again. At Riverview University, the air buzzed with the low sound of laughter and music drifting from dorm windows. Classes were done for the week. Couples walked hand in hand beneath the lamplight. The scent of blooming dogwood trees floated through the cool Virginia breeze. It was the kind of night meant for freedom, for youth, for beginnings. And for 2 students, Liam Carter and Emily Rhodes, it was supposed to be nothing more than a night of fun. Liam was 20, a business major with a calm, grounded charm. He wasn't a wild kid, more of a steady presence, The kind of guy who double-checked his gas tank and carried extra cash just in case. Friends said he was thoughtful to a fault, loyal, protective. Emily was 19, radiant and funny, with a laugh that filled every room she entered. She had just finished midterms and was craving a bit of release. Her friends said she was cautious by nature, rarely took risks. That's what made what happened next even harder to understand. That night they went to a party together. Casual, low-key, full of music and beer and the scent of cheap cologne. They weren't officially dating, just friends, maybe testing the spark between them. At around 1:30 a.m. they said their goodbyes and left. Liam told friends he was giving Emily a ride back to her dorm. They never made it there. By sunrise, Liam's parents knew something was wrong. He hadn't come home. He hadn't called. At first, they told themselves it was nothing. Maybe he stayed with friends, maybe he overslept. But by mid-morning, worry crept in. Liam was punctual, respectful, always checked in. Emily's parents, too, began calling around. When neither answered by noon, both families contacted the police. That afternoon, a patrol car found Liam's Toyota Selna parked at a turnout off Chesapeake Ridge, near the Severn River overlook. The car was empty. The doors unlocked. Keys on the seat. Wallets and clothing inside. But no Liam. No Emily. Detectives arrived fast. They recognized the eerie familiarity immediately. Another couple. Another car. Another lover's lane. The hair on the back of one officer stood up. He muttered, "It's happening again." The scene had the same strange orderliness the earlier murders had shown. Nothing stolen, no forced entry. Personal items left behind as if deliberately arranged. Liam's folded clothes were on the back seat. Shirt, pants, shoes. Emily's purse was open, wallet intact. Their car keys placed neatly near the gear shift. But the most chilling thing? There was no blood, no signs of struggle. It looked like they had simply stepped out of the car and vanished. For days, search teams combed the area. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades echoing against the riverbanks. Police dogs scoured the woods, noses pressed to the earth. Volunteers from the university joined in, holding flashlights, calling their names into the fog. Nothing. No bodies, no footprints, no discarded items. It was as if the night had swallowed them whole. Reporters descended on the scene. News vans lined the ridge entrance. Local papers ran headlines. 2 more vanish on Chesapeake Ridge. But behind closed doors, the FBI was panicking. Because this time, they had no crime scene. No bodies to autopsy, no shell casings, no fibers. Just absence. And in the world of homicide investigation, absence can be more terrifying than any amount of evidence. Some agents theorized the killer had escalated, that he'd learned from his mistakes, refined his methods, left less to trace. Others argued that Liam and Emily's disappearance might not be connected. Maybe they'd run away. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. But deep down, everyone knew better. 2 couples in 2 years. All young. All near the ridge. All found or gone under eerie ritualistic circumstances. That wasn't coincidence. That was pattern. In the days that followed, investigators tried to reconstruct the final hours of Liam and Emily's lives. At the party, witnesses said they'd seemed relaxed. Liam had a beer in his hand, but wasn't drunk. Emily was smiling, chatting with friends. When they left, she'd borrowed a jacket because it was getting chilly. The drive from the party to her dorm should have taken 15 minutes. The overlook, where the car was found? A 20-minute detour. Why would they have gone there? Romance? Privacy? Curiosity? Or did someone lure them? The imposter theory resurfaced.
Some agents believed the killer might have been using a fake light bar, posing as an officer to pull couples over. Others speculated he might have waited at known scenic spots, targeting cars that park there after dark. There was even talk that he knew the area too well, that he might have worked for the Ridge Park Service or had military experience in the region. Chesapeake Ridge ran between several naval installations, and many of its visitors were service members or students from nearby bases. Whoever this was, he understood the terrain, the blind curves, the quiet turnouts, the hours when traffic was almost non-existent. He could make a car disappear without anyone noticing for days. Liam's parents refused to believe he was dead. Every morning, his father drove to the ridge and sat by the water, scanning the horizon as if expecting to see his son walking out of the fog. Emily's mother, too, couldn't stop hoping. She told a local reporter, "Maybe they were kidnapped. Maybe they're alive somewhere. You can't just vanish like that. Not my baby. Not like that." But weeks turned into months, and months turned into silence. No ransom notes, no calls, no remains. Nothing but the haunting sound of the river at night and the echo of two names that became symbols of every parent's nightmare. One investigator, years later, described that search as walking through grief. He said, "We'd find shoe prints, animal tracks, beer bottles. Every small thing felt like a clue. And then you'd realize it wasn't. It was just noise, just ghosts in the mud." He paused before adding, "The worst part? We knew he'd do it again." The public panic reached new heights. For the first time, the FBI confirmed publicly that they believed the Chesapeake Ridge murders were the work of a serial offender. They urged caution, warned young couples not to park along the ridge after dark. Patrols were increased, but the fear had already taken root. People avoided the road entirely. Locals started locking their doors before sunset, and every time a car slowed near a turnout, hearts raced. Meanwhile, private theories multiplied. Some believed the killer was a former law enforcement officer, someone dismissed quietly for misconduct. Others thought he was a military police officer from one of the nearby bases, using his uniform to gain trust. There were even whispers about two perpetrators, one dominant, one submissive, working together. The FBI wasn't sure what to believe. They only knew the killer or killers were organized, intelligent, and growing bolder. And they feared that as long as he remained free, the ridge itself would continue to claim lives. Late one evening, two students driving home from Yorktown reported seeing a man standing near one of the overlooks, partially hidden in the shadows. They said he wasn't moving, just staring toward the water. When their headlights swept across him, he turned slowly, revealing what looked like a park ranger's jacket. But when they passed and looked back, he was gone. No vehicle, no flashlight, no sound. Just darkness. The case of Liam Carter and Emily Rhodes remains one of the most chilling chapters in the Chesapeake Ridge mystery. Their bodies were never found, their killer was never identified, and their disappearance deepened the sense that whoever was behind these crimes wasn't just killing for pleasure. He was hunting for control. He was erasing people, methodically, efficiently, completely. Years later, Liam's sister would visit the overlook where his car was found. She brought a bouquet of lilies and placed them on the guardrail. The tide was high that day, the river glinting beneath the sunlight. She whispered, "If you're still out there, come home." But the only answer was the whisper of the wind and the distant call of a gull. And that's when she realized, the ridge keeps its secrets. It always has. 3 couples, 6 young lives, no answers. And as the 3rd anniversary of the first killings approached, Virginia would learn that the Chesapeake Ridge killer wasn't finished. because by 1989, another pair would vanish, and what police found that year would shake them to their core. The pattern wasn't slowing down. It was evolving. By the spring of 1988, Virginia's highways had turned into quiet veins of dread. Couples who once drove down to the river or up to the ridge for a night away began avoiding those places entirely. Chesapeake Ridge, once a symbol of romantic freedom, had become a dark monument to death. For the FBI's task force, the mood was suffocating. They had 3 double murders now, 6 young lives gone, all within a stretch of 30 miles, each pair found in or near their car, each death involving an isolated road, a body of water, and traces of binding or control. It wasn't just murder, it was ritual.
Detective Rains, the lead investigator, stood by the evidence board late one April night. Red strings linked photographs. The burned-out Chevy Cavalier of Michael and Laura, the bloodied Toyota Tercel of Ethan and Kelly, and the charred remains of Liam and Emily's blue Honda. He stared at the photos, not as a cop, but as a man trying to read another's mind. "What are you trying to tell us?" he muttered. "What's your message?" No one knew it yet. But the next pair would vanish within weeks. May 1988. It was the start of tourist season. The sun warmed the colonial streets of Fairview, and the boardwalks near the Severn River buzzed with music and the smell of salt air. Among the crowds were Christopher Lane and Paula Tucker, 2 young lovers barely into their 20s. Christopher was a law student, calm, analytical, the type who liked chess and late-night debates. Paula was his opposite, a photography major, spontaneous and free-spirited. Together, they balanced each other perfectly. They'd been together just over a year. On Friday, May 20th, they decided to celebrate Christopher's acceptance into an internship program in D.C. The plan was simple: drive down to the ridge, park by the overlook, and have a quiet evening under the stars. They never came home. When Christopher's roommate woke up Saturday morning, he noticed the couch was still empty. No call, no note. Paula's dorm room was quiet too. By noon, both families were calling police, though at first no one wanted to say the word missing. By Sunday, that word became unavoidable. The next day, a park ranger noticed tire tracks near a boat ramp off Indian Field Creek. He assumed it was just weekend fishermen, until he saw a small white Toyota Celica partially submerged in the water. The driver's door was open. Inside, a purse floated in the footwell. Paula's camera lay cracked on the seat. A few feet away, something pale caught in the reeds. When the officers pulled it out, it was Rachel. She was fully clothed, wrists bound behind her back with a strip of white rope. Christopher's body was found later that day, further downstream, caught on a fallen tree. He too was bound. But unlike the others before them, there were no stab wounds, no gunshots, no sign of fire. The cause of death was drowning. The FBI arrived within hours. They taped off the area, collected the rope, and hauled the Toyota from the creek. The car's keys were missing. The driver's window was half rolled down. There was one odd thing. Paula's purse still had her wallet and cash. Nothing had been stolen. It wasn't a robbery. Rains crouched by the car, staring at the tire marks. They were clean, precise, almost like the driver had backed in carefully. "Why would he do that?" one of the techs asked. Rains straightened. "Because he's done this before." The coroner's report confirmed what they feared. Both victims had been alive when they entered the water. There were faint bruises on Paula's neck and wrists, and traces of adhesive residue around her mouth. She'd likely been gagged. Christopher had abrasions on his arms, consistent with rope burns, and a deep contusion on the side of his skull. He'd been struck, probably with a blunt object, before being pushed or forced into the creek. The FBI profiler, Dr. Vaughn Keller, soft-spoken but sharp as glass, studied the details. "He's controlling them," Keller said. "This isn't impulsive, it's methodical. He uses the same setting, same psychological script. Couples, private roads, water nearby, and he's not doing this for money or revenge. He's staging it."
Rains frowned. Staging? Yes. Look at the ropes, the way the car's positioned. He's creating scenes. It's his theater. Back at the FBI office in Norfolk, agents spread out photos of all 3 murder scenes on the conference table. They were looking for patterns: rope type, knots, tire treads, timing. One thing stood out. Each pair had been killed between Friday night and Sunday morning, always on or near the same stretch of Chesapeake Ridge. The intervals between the murders were irregular, months apart, but always during the same seasons, fall and spring. Keller tapped his pen against the first case file. He likes transitional seasons: cool air, darkness early, easier to control time and space. Another agent added, and maybe easier to catch couples out there. The room fell silent, because that meant he was still hunting. Local newspapers tried to downplay it. Authorities investigating series of suspicious deaths, one headline read. But everyone knew what it meant. The word serial killer began to circulate in whispers. Parents warned their kids to stay away from the ridge. Couples avoided night drives, yet curiosity spread like fog. People drove by the scenes just to see where it happened, where the lover's killer might have stood. The FBI hated that nickname, but it stuck. The Lover's Lane Killer. Weeks passed, then months. The investigation dragged on with no leads, no suspect. The task force followed hundreds of tips from ex-boyfriends, truck drivers, even park employees. They interviewed over 1,000 people. Nothing matched. But something began to form. A psychological outline of a man who understood authority, a man comfortable enough to approach couples without triggering fear. Someone who could make them roll down a window, open a door, comply. That idea, that he might be pretending to be law enforcement, terrified them. Because if he flashed a badge, showed a light, wore a uniform, the victims might have trusted him instantly. And in the quiet dark of the ridge, there'd be no witnesses. Rains couldn't shake that thought. He drove the same route night after night, trying to imagine what the victims saw. The road curved through thick woods, with stretches so quiet you could hear your heartbeat. The only sound was the chirp of frogs and the hum of distant highway lights. He pulled over near the old overlook, the same one where Christopher and Paula were last seen. His headlights swept across the guardrail, where faint scratches glinted in the beam. He got out and walked toward the edge. Below, the river shimmered silver in the moonlight. He whispered, "You bring them here, you talk to them, you calm them down, and then..." He let the rest hang in the air. Somewhere out there, the man who'd done this was still walking among them.
In FBI headquarters, Quantico, July 1988, the case now had its own code name, Operation Ridge. Profiles, forensic maps, and witness sketches lined the walls. The Bureau's best analysts tried to find overlap between each victim's social circle, jobs, and routines. No clear link emerged, except geography. All lived within driving distance of Fairview. All had spent time in parks, beaches, or naval bases nearby. When Keller examined the rope samples again, he noticed something subtle. Different knots, but the same type of fiber. Nylon, white, industrial grade. Not the kind found in camping stores. He sent it for lab testing. The result came back. It was the type commonly used by the U.S. Navy for mooring and equipment securing. That detail lit up the board like a flare. Because Fairview, Norfolk, and Severn Point sat right next to one of the largest naval bases in the country. And now, for the first time, the team wondered, what if the killer wasn't just pretending to be military? What if he actually was? They quietly reached out to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS. A joint review began. They cross-referenced personnel stationed at the bases during the murder years. They looked for behavioral flags, disciplinary issues, domestic incidents, unauthorized absences. It was a monumental task, tens of thousands of names. And in the middle of it all, another tip came in. A woman in Newport Bluff reported a disturbing encounter from months earlier. She'd been parked with her boyfriend near the Severn River one night when a man in a dark jacket approached their car flashing a badge. He told them they were trespassing and ordered them out. But something about him felt off. His badge looked homemade, his car unmarked. When he asked them to turn off their lights and step behind the vehicle, her boyfriend refused. The man's expression changed instantly. Cold. Angry. He muttered, "You should have listened," before walking back into the woods. They left immediately. That account sent chills through the task force. Rains wrote in his notes, "Possible impersonator. Could this be our guy testing boundaries?" If so, it meant he didn't stop after the murders. He was still trying, still prowling. But there was more. Around that same time, a park maintenance worker found a discarded badge holder near a rest stop along the ridge. The metal emblem was missing, but the leather case matched federal issue. No fingerprints, no DNA. Still, the symbolism was clear. By late summer, the FBI believed they were hunting a power-oriented killer, someone who enjoyed control, possibly tied to law enforcement or the military. Keller summarized it during a debrief. He's rehearsing authority. He uses procedure to disarm them. When they comply, he punishes them for it. He's feeding off their obedience. That theory haunted Rains more than anything else, because it meant this wasn't about rage or lust. It was about domination, a ritualized performance that gave him meaning. And worse, it meant he might never stop. In August, a partial breakthrough came. The rope fiber from the creek matched a rare batch used by a naval supplier discontinued in 1986. Only a handful of storage facilities still stocked it. The Bureau subpoenaed purchase records from nearby naval contractors. Out of hundreds of entries, one stood out: a supply requisition from a warehouse on the Severn River made by a petty officer Leonard Hale in late 1986. Hale had served for 8 years before leaving the Navy in 1987. He lived alone in an apartment 20 miles from the ridge. Rains and Keller exchanged a look. It was the first real lead they'd had in months. They tracked Hale's movements, spoke with his neighbors, pulled his employment files. Nothing overtly criminal, but there were notes about aggression, disciplinary write-ups, and a brief suspension for improper conduct with civilians. They brought him in for questioning. Hale was calm, disturbingly calm. He denied ever visiting the ridge, claimed the rope order was for a boat repair job. When they pressed him about the victims, he smiled faintly and said, "Seems like someone had a busy few years, huh?" The tone was almost mocking. When they asked to search his car, he refused without a warrant. And by the time they got one, 2 days later, Hale had vanished. His apartment was empty, beds stripped, drawers open, air smelling of bleach. But in his closet, they found one item left behind: a broken camera lens. The serial number matched Paula Tucker's Nikon. That discovery shook the Bureau. They issued a regional manhunt, coordinating with NCIS and local police. Hale's photo went out to every patrol officer from Norfolk to Richmond. Yet weeks turned into months, and there was no sign of him. No sightings, no records, no trace. It was as if he had dissolved into the fog. By the end of 1988, Operation Ridge was losing momentum. The press moved on to new stories, the public's fear dulled by time. But for the families, nothing dulled. They still gathered every few weeks, mothers, fathers, siblings, sitting in a circle in a small community center near Fairview. They shared updates, theories, memories. Sometimes they brought photos, letters, or news clippings. At one meeting, Paula's mother said softly, "He's still out there. He's watching us talk about him." Rains believed that too, because the killer's pattern wasn't broken. It was just waiting. And by the time they realized that, another couple would already have been dead. The winter of 1988 bled into early 1989 with a chill that clung to Chesapeake Ridge's rivers and roads like regret. The Ridgeway scenic route lay empty most nights now. Locals called it the ghost stretch. It was the kind of place you didn't drive unless you had to, and even then, you kept your headlights on high and your windows up. But despite the silence, the darkness hadn't gone dormant. It was only waiting for company. January 1989, a small town outside of Mariners Point. Derek Vaughn and Melissa Carter had been dating for about 6 months. He was 21, a quiet engineering student at Bayfield University. Melissa was 19, working part-time at a local cafe, saving money to return to school. Their relationship was young but serious. He was the kind of boyfriend who left handwritten notes. She was the kind of girl who folded them into origami hearts. On the evening of January 12th, Melissa got off work early. Derek picked her up in his red 1982 Toyota MR2, and they headed for a drive, their usual routine before heading home. The route? The Ridgeway scenic route. When Melissa's roommate woke the next morning and saw her bed empty, she wasn't alarmed, not yet. Melissa sometimes stayed over at Derek's apartment in Eastport. But by evening, when neither had called home, both families began to worry. Derek's father drove the route it usually took, Bayfield to Mariners Point, scanning the shoulders for their car. Nothing. By the next morning, he called the police, and by the weekend, the Ridgeway Task Force was on full alert again. January 15th, 1989, 8:42 a.m. A highway maintenance worker found a vehicle parked at a remote turnout along the Tanner River. It was Derek's Toyota MR2. The driver's door was open. The passenger seat was empty. Keys were in the ignition and the gear was in neutral. Inside, there were smudges on the windows, fingerprints, handprints, streaks of condensation. On the center console, a map folded open to a section of the Ridgeway. No signs of struggle, no blood, just absence. When police opened the trunk, the air that escaped was stale and heavy. Inside were the bodies of Derek Vaughn and Melissa Carter. The discovery froze the investigation room in silence. Both victims were fully clothed, both wrists were bound, same nylon rope, same pattern. Melissa's mouth was taped shut with gray duct tape. Derek had bruising around his neck, suggesting strangulation. The coroner later confirmed they'd both been killed elsewhere and placed in the trunk afterward. The time of death, roughly 48 hours earlier. There was one other detail. Both victims' shoes were missing. Rain stood by the car as it was towed out, his breath fogged in the cold air. It had been nearly a year since the last pair. He'd hoped, prayed that maybe the killer was done, that maybe he'd gotten sick, arrested, transferred, something. But now with this, the timeline made grim sense again. Fall 86, fall 87, spring 88, winter 1989. Different seasons, same road. The killer wasn't following a schedule. He was following a hunger. Back at the Bureau's Norfolk field office, the task force pinned the photos of Derek and Melissa to the growing wall of victims. 8 faces now stared back at them. Keller spoke softly, almost to himself. He's getting faster, more confident. The control is absolute now. What about the missing shoes? Raines asked. Keller tapped his pen against his notes. Souvenirs. Maybe he takes something personal after each kill. It's his proof, his memory. That realization chilled everyone in the room. Because if that was true, then somewhere out there, in a basement, a locker, a storage box, this man had a private museum of their pain. The investigation intensified. They combed through base rosters again, re-interviewed naval personnel, and expanded to include former Coast Guard and Park Service employees. They cross-checked every badge issued in the region in the past 5 years.
Still nothing concrete. But then came a tip, one that shook the task force to its core. A retired security guard named Harold Benton, who'd worked near the Tanner Ferry dock, came forward with a memory. He said that on the night of January 12th, he'd seen a dark-colored sedan parked near the river overlook, a government-issued Ford LTD, the kind often used by police. Inside, a man was sitting alone, engine off, headlights dimmed. When Benton drove past, he flashed a small light towards him, as if to signal him to move along. Benton did, but he caught the glimpse of the man's face. Square jaw, clean cut, short hair. He looked military, he said. When agents showed him a series of photos, he pointed to one immediately. It was Petty Officer Leonard Hale, the same man who'd vanished months earlier. The room fell silent. The possibility they feared the most was now undeniable. Hale was still alive, and he'd killed again. They launched a statewide manhunt. Flyers, bulletins, radio announcements. They raided Hale's old storage unit, hoping to find evidence linking him to the new murders. Inside, under layers of dust and mildew, they found several sealed boxes, each labeled by hand, Projects 1 to 5. Inside were everyday items, folded maps, Polaroid photos, gloves, rope, and duct tape. But one box contained something that made the agents freeze. A collection of shoes. 10 pairs. Each pair tagged with a small strip of masking tape, initials written in neat block letters, M and L, E and K, L and E, C and P, and D and M. The air in the evidence room turned cold. They had proof. Proof of his ritual. Proof of his control. Proof that the man they'd been chasing was cataloging death like art. The press erupted with the news. FBI zeroes in on Ridgeway killer, read the headlines. The public wanted blood, but Hale was gone. No activity on his Social Security, no bank records, no sightings. It was as if he'd known exactly how to disappear.
Some agents theorized he'd fled to another state. Others thought he'd enlisted under a new name, maybe even overseas. But Keller had a darker theory. What if he's not running? He asked one night, alone with Rains in the empty conference room. What if he's just watching? Rains frowned. Watching. Keller nodded. He knows how we operate. He knows procedure, timing, communication. What if he's here, among us, a ghost in uniform? The thought made Rain's stomach twist. He'd seen killers who hid in plain sight before, but none with this level of planning, precision, patience. This wasn't rage, it was discipline. And discipline doesn't vanish overnight. In February 1989, a potential sighting came in from a gas station near Briarfield. The clerk reported a man matching Hale's description, quiet, polite, driving a dark Ford sedan with no plates. He'd bought fuel and coffee, then asked for directions back to Mariner's Point. The clerk didn't think much of it until she saw the evening news. But by the time police arrived, the man was long gone. They pulled surveillance footage from nearby cameras, but the images were too grainy to confirm. Still, it was enough to reignite the hunt. March 1989. At a small riverside clearing near the Ridgeway, the families gathered again. Candles flickering in the wind, photos of their children clutched to their chests. Rains stood a few feet away, watching from the shadows. He'd promised himself not to get emotional, but when he saw Paula's mother light a candle beside Melissa's father, his throat tightened. 10 victims. 5 pairs. Each one taken from that same stretch of road. And still,
No arrest. No justice. Only questions. When the service ended, a woman approached Rains, middle-aged, wearing a dark coat, eyes red from crying. "Detective," she whispered, "you think he's finished?" Rains hesitated. He wanted to lie, to give her the comfort she was searching for, but he couldn't. Instead, he said quietly, "No, ma'am. Not yet." April 1989. Spring returned to the Ridgeway, and with it, the dread. Patrols increased, FBI agents disguised themselves as young couples, and checkpoints were set up at key turnouts. Weeks passed. Nothing happened. But then, just as they began to relax, a ranger discovered something buried near an old picnic area, a bundle wrapped in black tarp. Inside, rope, tape, and a pair of women's shoes. The shoes were clean, unworn, and tied neatly together. A note was tucked beneath them. In small, perfect handwriting, it read, "You missed one." When Rains read it, he felt the bottom drop out of his stomach, because the handwriting matched the labels on the boxes in Hale's storage unit. The killer wasn't gone. He was still here, still close, still playing his game. And what haunted Rains the most was that final line, "You missed one." It wasn't just a taunt. It was a promise. The investigation entered its darkest phase yet. No new bodies appeared, but signs did. Strange disturbances along the Ridgeway, broken branches arranged in deliberate patterns, tire tracks leading nowhere, radio interference on patrol channels. Each felt like a whisper, reminders that the ghost of the Ridgeway hadn't vanished. He'd only gone quiet, waiting for the next time someone, somewhere, forgot what kind of road they were driving down. By the summer of 1989, the Ridgeway Task Force had reached its breaking point. Files overflowed from cabinets. Photographs lined the walls like an unfinished jigsaw puzzle. Every detail, tire tracks, rope fiber, license plate, autopsy note, had been dissected and reassembled 100 times. Yet the picture refused to make sense. The killer's face, the killer's name, still a ghost. And every night, that ghost seemed to breathe a little louder. Agent Raymond Rains sat alone in the Bureau's Norfolk field office, smoke circling through the air like a slow confession. He stared at the evidence board until his eyes blurred. 8 victims, 4 couples, 1 vanishing point. On the table beside him lay the note found near the picnic site. "You missed one." He'd read it 100 times. Every letter was sharp, deliberate. Whoever wrote it was calm, methodical, not impulsive, not afraid. That was the problem. This wasn't a man who panicked. It was a man who planned. Across the room, Dr. Von Keller, the Bureau's profiler, leaned over a spread of case files. His voice was low, analytical, but there was something strained under it now, like a violin string stretched too tight. "He's adapted," Keller said quietly. "The note isn't random, it's ritual. Every one of these scenes, it's choreography. He's watching our reaction, timing our confusion, shaping his story." Rains rubbed his forehead. "So what's the story?" Keller's eyes lifted. Control. Always control. He mimics authority because authority's his language. Navy, police, ranger, it doesn't matter. He's not impersonating law enforcement anymore. He is law enforcement in his own world. Judge, jury, executioner. Rains exhaled slowly.
and we're just his audience. The Bureau decided to expand Operation Ridgeway beyond Chesapeake Bay. They sent out profiles to every state police department east of the Mississippi. They asked for similar cases. Couples found murdered in or near vehicles, bound, controlled, submerged. 3 potential matches came back. 1 from North Carolina, 1 from Maryland, 1 from Pennsylvania. But the timelines didn't fit perfectly. The methods were close, not identical. It was enough to raise the haunting question: was the Ridgeway killer traveling? Or worse, had others begun to copy him?
The NCIS, meanwhile, reopened its own inquiry into Petty Officer Leonard Hale. They traced his military career again: service aboard 2 ships, several commendations, and disciplinary actions for boundary violations. But then came the anomaly. Hale's personnel file had been altered. Pages were missing. Others had been replaced. And whoever did it knew exactly what to remove: the months that corresponded to the first Ridgeway murders. Someone had scrubbed his trail clean. Could be an internal cover-up, Keller suggested grimly. Maybe someone protecting one of their own. Maybe they didn't believe he was capable. Raines clenched his jaw. Or maybe they knew exactly what he was. In late July, a call came in from Chesapeake Bay Marina. A dock worker had found an abandoned boat tied to a service pier. The name Blue Silence painted neatly on its hull. Inside, rope, duct tape, and several water-damaged maps of the Ridgeway region. The registration traced back to, of course, Leonard Hale. But the boat hadn't been seen in over 6 months. Inside the cabin, investigators found traces of blood beneath the floorboards. It wasn't visible to the naked eye, but under luminol, it bloomed like dark flowers. DNA testing confirmed it matched one of the known victims, Paula Trent. He'd kept her blood as a souvenir. That night, Raines couldn't sleep. He replayed the details in his mind: the precision, the patience, the symbolic cruelty. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, looking out over the quiet city lights. He thought of all the parents who still called him, asking for updates. He thought of Paula's mother's trembling voice: "You think he's finished?" And he thought of the note: "You missed one." That wasn't gloating. That was instruction. An invitation. The killer wanted them to keep searching. He wanted to be found. August 1989, Bayfield. A new task force meeting. FBI agents, NCIS officers, and state police sat shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with exhaustion and stale coffee. Keller stood at the head of the table, pointer in hand, eyes hard. This isn't random. This is structure. The murders form a geographic pattern. Look. He clicked the projector, displaying a map. 5 red markers pinpointed the murder sites. When connected by lines, they formed a distinct shape, a near-perfect triangle with a small void in the center. "What's there?" one agent asked. "An abandoned ranger station, decommissioned in 1985. The room went silent. Raines felt his pulse quicken. "Could be a base of operations," Keller continued. "It's remote, off-grid, perfect line of sight to all 4 crime scenes. If he wanted to observe, listen, or control radio frequencies, that's the ideal spot." Within hours, the FBI secured a warrant and sent a tactical team to investigate. The ranger station sat deep in the forest, half swallowed by vines and ivy. Dust coated everything, but there were footprints, fresh ones. Inside, the rooms were sparse. A cot, a propane stove, a stack of old newspapers. And in the corner, a corkboard. Pinned to it were photographs of cars, couples, license plates. Every one of them taken from a distance, telephoto lens. Some showed people who were later murdered, others total strangers. A logbook sat beside the board, filled with times, dates, and observations. Friday, 11:37 p.m. Couple parked by curve 12,
stayed 15 minutes. Saturday, vehicle, Toyota, blue, parked near Overlook 3, moved 2:12 a.m. Sunday, patrol passed, waited. Each line read like a hunter's notes. Among the photos was one that froze Rains in place. It showed the FBI's own surveillance car, the one they'd used months earlier during the decoy operation. Taken from a nearby ridge. He'd been watching them. Son of a, Rains murmured under his breath. The implication was clear. Hale, or whoever this killer truly was, had monitored the investigation in real time. They weren't hunting him. He was studying them. Further inside the cabin, forensic teams found a radio transceiver rigged to pick up emergency channels. He'd been listening to police chatter, dispatch frequencies, and FBI communications. That's how he stayed one step ahead. He didn't have supernatural luck. He had information. Rains stared at the radio setup, anger boiling beneath the fatigue. He was inside our perimeter the whole damn time. Keller said nothing. He simply picked up one of the photographs and turned it over. On the back was a handwritten message. "I see you too, Agent R." The room went silent. Rains' hands trembled slightly. For the first time, the case had stopped being a case. It had become personal. September 1989. The Bureau doubled its manpower. Surveillance teams were stationed along every ridgeway entrance. Helicopters patrolled at night. Motion sensors were placed near all known dump sites. But the killer didn't move, didn't surface. It was like chasing wind. The media frenzy reignited, reporters broadcasting live from the Ridgeway, tabloids speculating about the ghost of Chesapeake Ridge, talk shows debating whether the FBI had failed. Every time Rains turned on the TV, he saw his own frustration reflected in strangers' faces. And the families, they began to lose faith. On September 28th, Paula's mother called Rains at home. Her voice was trembling. "I got something," she whispered. "What do you mean?" "In the mail. No return address." He told her not to touch it, then drove straight there. The envelope contained a single photograph, black and white, grainy. It showed the candlelight vigil from March. Rains recognized himself standing at the edge of the crowd, half in shadow. On the back of the photo, written in the same precise hand as before, "Not finished yet." By October, fear had returned to Chesapeake Ridge like an old friend. The Ridgeway was empty again. Patrol cars sat at intersections with lights flashing silently through the fog. But there were no new killings, no discoveries, only silence. And that silence, that absence, began to feel worse than the murders themselves.
Because it meant one of two things. Either the killer had finally stopped, or he was waiting for the right time to start again. December 1989. The FBI officially reduced the task force. After 3 years, hundreds of interviews, and thousands of man-hours, there was no suspect in custody. Rains refused to let it go. He worked the case long after everyone else had moved on. Every new missing person report, every unexplained vehicle, every river search, he read them all. The Bureau labeled the Ridgeway killings inactive, pending new evidence. But Rains didn't believe in closure, not in this case. He kept the files in his office under lock and key, visiting them like an old wound that wouldn't heal. Sometimes he'd reread the log from the ranger station, tracing the killer's notes with his finger, trying to feel the rhythm of his thoughts. Sometimes he'd drive the Ridgeway alone, headlights off, listening to the quiet. And sometimes, late at night, he'd see a pair of headlights flicker in the rearview mirror, too close, too steady, before vanishing into the dark. He never knew if it was real, or if it was the Ridgeway reminding him, some roads never let you go.
By the spring of 1990, Chesapeake Ridge had become more than just a road. It was a ghost corridor. Locals drove it in silence. The once romantic overlook points where couples used to watch the sunset were now empty, haunted by stories whispered across Tideport's coastal towns. People no longer left their windows down, and every unfamiliar vehicle was an object of suspicion. But somewhere inside the FBI's Bayfield field office, a team of agents refused to let the silence win. The Ridgeway killer had left no fingerprints, no DNA that matched anyone in their system, no clear motive. Yet there were patterns, small fractures in the stillness that hinted at something more deliberate, more intimate. The lead agent on the case, Special Agent Thomas Drexel, sat in his dimly lit office one evening, a stack of photographs spread across his desk. Each photo captured something eerily similar: two young victims, a vehicle pulled off the road, personal belongings scattered with clinical precision. Drexel had seen dozens of homicide scenes in his 20 years on the job, but this case burrowed into his mind like no other. Each pair of victims seemed chosen, not random. The positioning of their cars suggested they had trusted whoever approached them. He tapped a pencil against the first crime scene photo: Michael and Laura's car, doors ajar, ignition off. Then the next, Ethan and Kelly's vehicle, similarly parked, interior light faintly visible from the road. Then Liam and Emily. Then Christopher and Paula. Then Derek and Melissa. All couples, all found near water, all murdered in similar time frames, late night within a 30-mile radius. The question gnawed at him: was the killer a law enforcement officer? The idea wasn't new. Locals had whispered about it for years. Several witnesses in nearby areas had reported seeing unmarked cars flashing lights or signaling drivers to pull over. One woman, a university student returning from Mariners Point, recalled a man in plain clothes stepping out of an old white sedan, claiming she'd been speeding. But something about his demeanor, his insistence she exit her vehicle, made her lock the doors and drive off. She filed a report the next morning. No officer on record matched her description. If that detail was true, Drexel thought, it meant the killer knew procedure, knew how to command trust. He leaned back, staring at the map pinned to his wall. Red pins marked the murder sites. Blue pins reported suspicious incidents that never escalated to violence. A line drawn between them formed a haunting shape, a loose curve that followed the Tanner River and ended near the naval operations perimeter. "Military connection," he murmured. It wasn't far-fetched. Bayfield Naval Station was one of the largest on the East Coast, and countless officers, enlisted personnel, and contractors rotated through the area. If the killer had access to uniforms, credentials, or vehicles, that could explain how he disarmed his victims so easily. But there was another theory, one that came from the victims' families, not the investigators. In early '91, Elaine Carter, Melissa's fictionalized sister, organized a small press conference. Her eyes were weary, her tone trembling between grief and determination. "We don't think these killings are random," she said into the microphones. "We believe someone knew them, or at least knew where they'd be that night." Elaine had spent years privately interviewing people connected to her sister's life. One of them, a co-worker from the cafe where Melissa had worked, mentioned a man who often loitered in the parking lot, waiting by her car after hours. He claimed to be an off-duty officer. Elaine took this information to the FBI, but Drexel's team had already encountered that same name, an alias, one tied to a man who'd been dishonorably discharged from the Navy in 1985 for misconduct. His real name was Warren Heller. Heller had vanished shortly after the first murders. But when agents checked military records, they discovered something even stranger. Heller's service record listed an address on file just 2 miles from where the first bodies were found along the ridgeway. They pulled his service record. Disturbing. Incidents of stalking female colleagues, unauthorized use of a government vehicle, psychological evaluation noting impulse control issues. Yet there was no conclusive evidence tying him to the Ridgeway murders. For months, Drexel's team surveilled known associates, checked abandoned naval housing, and even followed up on unconfirmed sightings. Each lead collapsed into nothing. The case felt cursed, as though the killer was always one step ahead. Then, in 1993, a hiker stumbled upon something in the woods near Tanner River State Reserve, less than 1 mile from where Tyler and Kate had vanished. Under layers of decayed leaves and mud, partially hidden by tree roots, was half-buried a box. Inside, old Polaroid photos. Most were water-damaged, faces blurred beyond recognition, but a few were clear enough to make out. 2 young couples, different cars, a glint of moonlight on the river behind them. When Drexel saw the photos, his stomach dropped. The angles, they were the same as those used in official crime scene documentation. Someone had been watching before the murders happened. The discovery reignited national attention. News outlets ran headlines like, "Ridgeway Killer may have photographed victims before attacks." Tips flooded in, false leads, confessions, conspiracy calls. But amid the chaos, one tip stood out. A retired park ranger came forward, claiming he remembered a man in his 30s frequently visiting the overlooks in the late 80s. The ranger described him as polite but intense, often photographing couples from a distance, saying he was working on a love-themed art project. The description matched Warren Heller almost perfectly.
Drexel's team combed through storage units across Chesapeake County, searching for any trace of him. Months later, they found one rented under an alias similar to his old service ID. Inside, camera equipment, reels of undeveloped film, and a Navy-issued flashlight identical to one used by investigators. But no sign of the man himself. Every piece of evidence screamed proximity, yet no direct proof existed that tied him to the murders. DNA testing in the early 90s was still limited, and most of the physical samples from the crime scenes were compromised by humidity and time. Still, Drexel felt closer than ever. He imagined the killer, methodical, quiet, moving under cover of darkness, familiar enough with the back roads to vanish before anyone noticed. He thought of the couples, the laughter that must have filled their cars minutes before their final moments. Then he looked at the evidence board again. 4 sets of victims, each case connected by geography and ritual. But the deeper Drexel went, the more unsettling it became, because when cross-referencing vehicle logs from the naval base in 1986 through 1989, he found something no one expected. On at least 2 of the murder nights, a government-issued vehicle matching witness descriptions of an unmarked white car had been logged out and never properly logged back in. Whoever signed for it used a forged signature. The paper trail ended in the same year Warren Heller disappeared. The FBI quietly reopened parts of the case in 1994 under a special review task force, this time bringing in criminal profilers. The profile that emerged was chillingly precise. Male, mid-30s to early 40s at the time of the murders, law enforcement or military background, knowledge of investigation techniques, possibly fixated on couples as symbols of something denied to him. He views the Ridgeway as his domain, a stage for his control. The couples represent trust, something he feels betrayed him. Drexel underlined one line in the report. He likely revisits the sites. He may even attend vigils or follow the case through the news.
In later interviews, Drexel admitted he sometimes suspected the killer had been watching the investigation itself. Anonymous letters were sent to newspapers, taunting law enforcement for their failures. Some claimed to come from a friend of the victims. Others signed off with cryptic phrases, "You'll find me where the river bends." No handwriting match ever came through. By 1996, the Ridgway Task Force had dwindled to a handful of investigators still haunted by what they'd seen. Drexel retired in 1998. His final report left open-ended. There is strong circumstantial evidence of military or law enforcement involvement. The killer demonstrated familiarity with investigation patterns, vehicle inspection methods, and terrain awareness. Motive remains unclear. Possible sexual component, but unconfirmed. Identity, still unknown. For the families, the years became decades. The Ridgway remained silent. But in the age of modern forensics, silence doesn't last forever. In 2009, when DNA analysis had advanced dramatically, samples from the old evidence boxes were retested. A partial profile was recovered from fibers found on one of the victim's clothing, possibly skin cells. It wasn't a complete match, but it was enough to cross-reference with military archives. A new name surfaced, one that had never appeared in the case files before, and when investigators traced that name, they found something that made even veteran agents go quiet. The man had died in 1991 in a boating accident on the Tanner River. But among his possessions recovered that year was an old camera. Inside, undeveloped film. When developed decades later, one of the photos showed a familiar stretch of road, the Ridgway Scenic Route, and in the distance, two figures standing by their car. The timestamp? 1 week before the first murders. The world would soon learn that the road still had secrets left to tell. 8. The Colonial Parkway was no longer just a crime scene. It had become a legend. A whisper passed through the Virginia backroads, a ghost story told to new drivers who didn't yet understand why their parents avoided the overlook lanes at night. But for investigators and families, the legend was a wound that refused to close. After the partial DNA discovery in 2009, a new task force formed, smaller, more specialized, determined to re-examine every piece of evidence through a modern lens. They called it Operation Silent Tide. At its center was a new generation of FBI analysts, forensic experts, and retired investigators who'd refused to let the case fade away. Among them was Special Agent Carolyn Finch, a quiet, methodical analyst who grew up only 20 minutes from the parkway. As a teenager, she'd seen the news reports, blurred photos of cars, candlelight vigils, the endless headlines asking the same question, who killed them? Now, 2 decades later, she sat before stacks of yellowing case files, her mind threading connections that older systems had missed. She started with the most haunting piece, the recovered film from the dead man's camera. The photo of the parkway, time-stamped just before the first murders, wasn't conclusive proof of guilt, but when Finch digitally enhanced it, something caught her eye, a faint reflection in the car's rear window. It looked like a badge. The reflection wasn't clear enough for identification, but it suggested what many had long feared, that the killer used the guise of authority to lure his victims. That discovery reignited the debate among investigators and the public alike. Was the Colonial Parkway killer a cop, a federal agent, or someone pretending to be one? To understand the theories, Finch had to return to the beginning. Theory 1. The Inside Man. This theory, whispered among retired agents, claimed the killer wasn't an outsider at all. He was one of them, a law enforcement officer with access to files, radios, and unmarked cars. Old logs revealed that certain internal communications about patrol schedules had leaked before the murders began. No one ever confirmed how, but the coincidence was too eerie to ignore. On nights when patrol coverage was lightest, the killer struck. A retired sheriff's deputy from York County told Finch something chilling. You could tell he knew our patterns. He avoided main roads, timed the murders between radio check-ins.
Whoever he was, he'd either worn a badge or shadowed someone who had. That deputy also admitted a disturbing memory. In the fall of 1987, he was flagged down by a man claiming to be a state investigator asking for assistance in a surveillance operation along the parkway. He couldn't recall his name, but remembered the man's demeanor, controlled, polite, but with an edge that made the hair on his arms stand up. When asked why he never reported the encounter, the deputy sighed. "Because back then, we trusted the uniform. You didn't question a man who spoke the language of authority."
Theory 2. The military connection. Finch also pursued the theory that had haunted Drexel years before, the Navy link. The proximity of the crimes to Norfolk's naval base wasn't coincidence. Military presence in the region was massive. Hundreds of personnel commuted along the same stretches of road every day. But what struck Finch was a classified note buried deep in the archives, a list of naval personnel investigated for misconduct in the mid-'80s. Among them were 3 men dishonorably discharged for harassment and unauthorized weapons possession. 2 left Virginia. 1 stayed. The third name was the most enigmatic. He'd changed addresses multiple times between 86 and 89, all within a 20-mile radius of the parkway. His file abruptly ended with a transfer request to a department that didn't exist. The military, when pressed, claimed the records had been lost in transition. Finch circled his name on her whiteboard and stared at it for a long time. She couldn't prove he was the killer, but every breadcrumb led closer to him. Theory 3. The two-killer hypothesis. Among true crime forums and even some retired detectives, another theory emerged. Maybe it wasn't just one killer. The logic was unnerving but plausible. The 4 double homicides spanned 3 years. The patterns were consistent, but the methods slightly evolved. The first couple had been strangled, the second stabbed, the third shot. The fourth vanished entirely, their remains never found. Could one person have changed tactics so drastically, or did a second individual take over? Finch found herself poring over photographs from the later crime scenes, noticing subtle changes, footprints, tire tracks, the angle of approach. She noticed something the old reports had missed. In the last case, the footprints appeared smaller, narrower. A copycat? An accomplice? No one could say, but the idea unsettled her more than anything else, because if there were 2, one might still be alive. In 2010, one of the victim's brothers, Mark Ellison, received a letter with no return address. The handwriting was neat, almost military in precision. "You're still looking for ghosts," it read. "But ghosts don't leave prints." The envelope contained a faded photograph of a bridge overlooking the York River. On the back, "I liked that one best." The letter was sent from Richmond, postmarked near an old postal distribution center that no longer kept surveillance tapes. Forensic analysis found no usable prints, no DNA. But the paper matched a batch manufactured in the late 1980s, no longer in production. Finch believed the letter was authentic, possibly written by someone with knowledge of the crimes or the killer himself. When she showed it to Drexel, now retired and gray-haired, he went silent. "He's still playing," Drexel said finally. "After all these years, he's still trying to remind us he's smarter." Theory 4. The photographer. Remember the box of Polaroids found in the woods years earlier? Finch reanalyzed them using modern software. One photo, long dismissed as too blurry, contained a clue invisible to the naked eye. Embedded in the corner was the faint reflection of a vehicle's front grille, matching a model of unmarked law enforcement sedans used in Virginia during the late 1980s. In another image, a shape loomed behind a tree, a man's silhouette holding something metallic. Finch froze the frame, enhanced it, and saw what looked like a camera strap. If the same man had taken those photos before each murder, he wasn't killing at random. He was collecting, staging his victims like scenes in a morbid project.
That led to the most sinister theory of all, that the Colonial Parkway killer wasn't driven by rage or impulse, but by obsession with capturing control. Late one night, as Finch sifted through archived interviews, she stumbled upon a transcript never followed up on, dated 1988, from a man named Russell Dean, a fisherman who often docked near the parkway. He told investigators he once saw a white car parked along the overlook, weeks before the first murders. Inside, a man sat alone with binoculars. When asked to describe him, Russell said he looked like military, but it was his eyes that bothered me. He wasn't looking at people. He was studying them. He was dismissed at the time. No corroborating evidence, no crime yet to match his claim, but in hindsight, his description aligned perfectly with what the task force later theorized: a methodical predator who stalked from the shadows long before he struck. By 2013, Operation Silent Tide had hit the same wall every generation of investigators did. The gap between what they could feel was true and what they could prove. Then, by sheer accident, a piece of evidence surfaced that changed everything. A storage unit in Chesapeake, repossessed for non-payment, contained a box labeled training materials, photography. Inside were old film reels, some still sealed. One reel, when restored, revealed footage shot from inside a vehicle driving along the Colonial Parkway in 1987. At first, the footage seemed ordinary: trees, water, the road. But at the 13-minute mark, a parked car appeared on the shoulder. Inside it, two people, laughing, unaware they were being filmed. The reel ended with a sharp cut and a faint reflection of the driver's face in the window. Blurred, but visible enough to show a navy cap resting on the dashboard. When Finch slowed the footage, she noticed something else. The timestamp matched the week of the second murders. But the man who rented that storage unit? He'd been dead for nearly 15 years. Theories spiraled. Some believed the killer had an accomplice who continued his ritual long after his death. Others believed he was never dead at all, that the boating accident was staged. Every time investigators thought they were closing in, the case expanded, like fog rolling over the James River, shifting, hiding, consuming. Finch kept one photo on her desk, the first couple, Michael and Laura, smiling beside their car. She studied their faces, the life that existed before the parkway changed everything. What kind of man could look at people like that, alive, happy, and decide they didn't deserve to see another sunrise? Sometimes in her quietest hours, Finch felt like she was staring back at the same road that had devoured generations of truth seekers. She once told a colleague, "I think whoever he was, he wanted to be remembered. And he is. Every time we reopen the files, we bring him back to life." Decades later, the Chesapeake Ridge Parkway remained one of America's most confounding, unsolved serial cases. Theories multiply, evidence evolves, but the killer's shadow still lingers between the trees. And at night, when fog settles on the river and headlights cut through the mist, locals say you can almost see it. A flash of white in the dark, a car pulling over, a door creaking open, and the faint echo of footsteps on wet asphalt.
The Chesapeake Ridge Parkway never forgot. Even when years turned into decades, when the trees grew thicker and the road signs rusted at their edges, something in the air there still felt wrong. The locals say it's the silence. It hangs differently, as if the road itself remembers every scream, every desperate breath that never reached help. For the families, time never softened the pain. The photographs of their loved ones, once clear and colorful, began to fade, but the grief remained sharp. Every year, On the anniversary of the first murder, they gathered near the river bend, lighting candles that flickered in the mist. Among them stood Elaine Carter, now gray-haired, still holding her sister's locket. For nearly 40 decades, she had chased answers that never came. "I just want to know why," she whispered once to a journalist. "Even if I never know who, I want to know why." But the Ridge never gave up its why. In 2021, a Cold Case podcast revived public interest in the murders. It wasn't the first time the case had been featured in documentaries, books, and online forums, but this one was different. The host, a former investigative journalist, had obtained new material, leaked FBI memos, unredacted field reports, and fragments of audio from early witness interviews. He called the series The Ghost of the Ridge. Each episode peeled back another layer of the mystery, mixing the facts with atmospheric storytelling, something eerily similar to the Nest Stories style that would come to dominate true crime narration years later. The first episode went viral. Within weeks, thousands of listeners began reanalyzing the case, comparing photos, timing, weather reports, even moon phases from the nights of the murders. The crowd-sourced investigation became obsessive, each theory more elaborate than the last. A rogue intelligence agent, a pair of thrill killers, even a serial offender linked to other East Coast murders of the same era. But, hidden among the noise, one email caught the journalist's attention. The sender's name was Observer_89. The message read simply, "You're looking in the wrong decade. Try 1979. Same road, same method, same silence." Attached was a low-resolution image of a newspaper clipping, an old unsolved case of two teenagers found dead in their car off a wooded trail near the Chesapeake Bay. The description of the scene? Identical to the first Ridge murders, 7 years before they officially began. The journalist turned the file over to the FBI. When Agent Carolyn Finch, now heading the Cold Case Review, received it, she felt something shift. If the clipping was genuine, it meant the killer might have started long before 1986. She ordered an immediate search through archived homicide records. Within a week, her team found 2 more similar cases from the late 1970s. Both couples, both parked near secluded river access points, both unsolved. The victims had been assumed unrelated, the cases buried by time and bureaucracy. But when Finch requested the old evidence boxes, she noticed a chilling detail on one of the car doors. Faint residue from adhesive tape, shaped like a rectangle, exactly where a fake badge might have been placed. It was a small thing, maybe coincidence, but to Finch, it felt like the killer had just whispered across decades, "I was here first." Meanwhile, the families of the Ridge victims lived their lives suspended between grief and obsession. Laura's father, once a police officer himself, had died years earlier, still keeping a notebook by his bed, filled with notes, newspaper cuttings, and sketches of the Ridge's topography. Kelly's brother became a private investigator, convinced he could solve what the FBI couldn't. He died in 2016 of a heart attack while reviewing the files late into the night. Emily's mother, who once baked cookies for the search volunteers, stopped going outside after sunset. When asked why, she said softly, "Because that's when he's out there. Whoever he was, he doesn't die until someone says his name." In late 2023, a quiet breakthrough came from an unexpected place, a private DNA lab in California. They had been developing new methods of extracting genetic material from degraded fibers. One of the Chesapeake Ridge samples was retested. This time, they found a near-complete profile. It didn't match anyone in CODIS, but when run through genealogical databases, a connection emerged.
a distant relative. The match traced to a family with deep military roots along the mid-Atlantic coast, including one member who had served as a civilian contractor for the Navy police during the late 1980s. His name was Andrew Keller. He had died in 1991, the same year as the supposed boating accident on the Chesapeake Bay. Finch froze when she saw the name. It matched the Keller alias used to rent the Ridge storage unit years earlier. For the first time in nearly 40 years, there was a real name attached to the faceless killer. But even then, the evidence stopped short. The DNA wasn't 100% conclusive. It could have been from contamination or familial transfer. There would be no trial, no confession, no justice in the traditional sense. Still, Finch felt the air shift. She called Elaine Carter personally to tell her the news. "We can't say it's him beyond doubt, but we believe he's the one." Elaine didn't cry. She just looked out her window toward the dark horizon and whispered, "Then may the river keep him." The official press release came months later. It was brief, sterile, almost anticlimactic. The Chesapeake Ridge homicide cases remain under review. Recent developments suggest a potential link to a deceased individual. The investigation continues. That was all. No closure, no public revelation. But for those who had followed the case their entire lives, that small acknowledgement was enough. The killer, whether alive or dead, had finally been seen.
Years later, filmmakers and journalists revisited the case again and again. Some treated it like folklore, others like tragedy. But the truth, raw, complex, unyielding, remained buried in the soil of Maryland's coast. At the heart of it all was a simple, devastating pattern: young love meeting evil under the cover of night. Historians of crime would later say that the Chesapeake Ridge murders marked the end of innocence for a generation, a time when America began to realize that danger could wear any face, even one wearing a badge. Today the ridge looks peaceful. The water glistens under the sun, the road freshly paved. Tourists drive by unaware of the ghosts riding beside them, but locals know. They still see the flicker of headlights where no car should be, hear the crunch of gravel behind them when the night turns too quiet. And if you listen closely, just as the fog begins to roll in, you can almost hear the faint echo of a woman's voice, soft, trembling, asking into the void, "Why them?" No answer ever comes, only the steady whisper of the river against the rocks. Some roads, it seems, were never meant to lead home. In the final scene of the Hypothetical Nest Stories documentary, the camera would pan along the Chesapeake Ridge Parkway at dusk, the golden light fading, the trees casting long shadows over the asphalt. A voice would narrate softly, "Between 1986 and 1989, 10 young lives were stolen along this road. Their stories remain unsolved, their laughter preserved only in photographs. Decades later, the ridge still waits for justice, for remembrance, for peace. Until then, it stands as a reminder that some mysteries don't end, they echo." And as the music fades, a final line appears on the screen. "If you know something, say something, because silence only helps the darkness hide." Then the screen fades to black. The Chesapeake Ridge Parkway remains one of America's most haunting unsolved serial crimes, a real-life riddle that defies time. And even now, the question lingers like a shadow on the road. Who was the watcher in the fog? And will the ridge ever sleep again? If this story gripped you, imagine what else still hides in America's coldest case files. Diggers, subscribe for more chilling true crime investigations that defied every expectation. Like this video if you believe every unsolved case deserves another look. Comment where you're watching from and whether you think the serial killer was ever caught.